The Democrats' path to retaking the United States Senate begins in Colorado, and for the first time, unaffiliated voters can participate in a Senate primary in our state. Democrats and unaffiliated voters will choose the candidate to face Republican Senator Cory Gardner, one of the most vulnerable incumbents in America. A large field is down to two. Former Governor John Hickenlooper wanted to be president, but his campaign quickly ran out of gas, and he came home to run for Senate, a job he said he didn't want and wouldn't be very good at. Hickenlooper's centrist positions often put him at odds with the Democratic Party lurching to the left. Former Speaker of the House Andrew Romanoff says he is the candidate for progressives, but he's lost two high-profile races, and the national money in support is behind Hickenlooper. Mail-in ballots go out this week. It's time for Democratic and unaffiliated voters to make their choice. This is Decision 2020, Race for the Senate. Good evening. I'm Kyle Clark. You'll soon have your ballot, so let's have a conversation with the Democratic Senate candidates. Former Colorado Speaker of the House Andrew Romanoff will appear first on your ballot. Second on your ballot will be former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. They have not seen the questions tonight. Most answers will be 60 seconds. The candidates have agreed not to interrupt each other because we're holding this debate remotely. Responses, rebuttals will be at my discretion, so let's get started. Coloradans are marching and organizing for social justice and for police reform in numbers unprecedented in recent memory. Mr. Hickenlooper, do you think that we should defund the police? If so, how? And if not defund the police, why not?
Well, I don't think we should defund the police, but I do believe we need to reform the police. When I first became mayor, I made some major efforts at police reform, but we didn't get far enough. And now we have to recognize that things like making sure police officers turn on their cameras, that they don't use strangleholds, these are essential parts of any reform effort. We also have to look beyond just police reform and make sure that we're getting equal opportunity in housing, in education, equal opportunity in jobs. We have to restructure a whole different way to think about this country and recognize this is a moment in time where people all over the country are rising up and really demanding that we live true to our values, that this is a country where everyone has equality under law.
Mr. Hickenlooper, thank you. Mr. Romanoff, the advocates say that reform simply does not do enough. Some of them want to take away resources to defund the police. What do you think?
Reform is not enough. We do need to shift resources and demilitarize the police. We need to invest in community services. John fundamentally misunderstands this moment, just as he misunderstood what Black Lives Matter means. Frankly, it doesn't do us much good to say Black Lives Matter when day after painful day we act as if they don't. Yes, we need independent oversight bodies to hold police officers accountable. Yes, we need body cameras and an end to the brutal practices of chokeholds and strangleholds. But as long as we continue to treat incarceration as the solution to every problem, we will not get the equality that we deserve. John brought in the author of the broken windows theory, which is responsible in part for this era of mass incarceration. We need a new approach, and that's why I stand with the protesters in their effort to turn America into a source of equality and end the oppression that has persisted for generations and centuries.
Mr. Hickenlooper, I want to give you the opportunity to respond, specifically to the idea that when you were recently asked what Black Lives Matters means to you, you inserted the phrase, all lives matter. Do you understand why that was offensive to some people?
Yes, of course, and I stepped on my own words. Black lives matter. And George Floyd and Paul Childs, the 15-year-old African-American boy who was shot in his front hall by a Denver police officer as I was being, 2 weeks before I was being sworn in, they've been held to a different system of justice for far too long. And when I was mayor, we began major police reform in partnership with the Ministerial Alliance, who's endorsed me in this campaign. But we have so much farther to go. And I think what we're seeing now in looking at moving resources to let kids have diversion programs and not putting them in jail, that's just the first step. We've got a long way to go.
Hi, Mr. Hickenlooper, thank you. I want to continue this conversation with a question from my colleague, 9 News political reporter Marshall Zellinger.
Both of you talk about police reform, social justice, and racial equality. Tell me specifically, what did you do when you were in a position of elected power and had the ability not just to talk about change, but make it happen? Mr. Romanoff, I'll start with you.
You bet. So I joined my colleagues in the legislature in increasing funding for civil rights enforcement. I recognize that putting civil rights laws on the books is not enough unless we actually implement those laws. I had a chance to make a headway on this issue before I ever served in public office. When I turned 21, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, to join the Southern Poverty Law Center in its fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups. I did not expect to be having the same fight 30 years later, or to find a president of the United States on the other side. I also designed and supervised an undercover investigation of employment discrimination on behalf of a state civil rights agency. So I understand deeply that the discrimination, the segregation, the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow have subjected African Americans to outright inequality since well before our country's founding. And it is not enough for us to declare victory at this point until we act on these words that Black Lives Matter.
Mr. Hickenlooper, you've twice now brought up some of your reforms when you were the mayor of Denver. If I could ask you to answer Marshall's question about what you did in elected office, based on your 2 terms as governor, were you able to move the needle on police reform or racial justice there?
Let me give a couple specifics first about while I was mayor and working with the Black Ministerial Alliance. This is 10 years before Ferguson. We created an Office of the Independent Monitor with the subpoena power to make sure that any allegation of police brutality got investigated thoroughly, created a civilian oversight commission so neighborhoods could have a voice in how their community was policed. We hired minority recruiters. We made sure every police officer had to do crisis intervention training so that they understood not to escalate situations. Now, as governor, we focused more on judicial reform and making sure that prisoners got training and job skills and hopefully had jobs waiting before we put them back into the community. We essentially completely ended administrative segregation, the solitary confinement that took so many of the prisoners who have mental health issues and locked them up and in many cases exaggerated their mental issues dramatically. These are some of the most fundamental things that you can do. We also made sure that we made it very difficult to try teenagers as adults for crimes they commit.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. So looking for some quick answers here on this same issue. These are yes or no questions. Would invite you to answer them, yes or no. Colorado State Legislature appears ready to strip law enforcement officers of qualified immunity so that they can be held personally liable for misconduct. I'm going to ask each of you in turn if you would support a bill in the U.S. Senate to remove qualified immunity for every law enforcement officer in America. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes, as described in Colorado.
All right. Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
I want to ask you each if you believe that the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis was a murder. Mr. Romanoff?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper?
Yes.
Mr. Hickenlooper, do you think that Marvin Booker's death while you were the mayor at the hands of Denver jail deputies was a murder as well?
It was egregious neglect, and I think falls into that category of murder.
As such, do you think that prosecutors, District Attorney Beth McCann or the Attorney General at the state level should reopen the investigation into Martin Booker's death while you were mayor?
Well, they've gone through that process thoroughly. At a certain point, I'm not sure it's going to return benefit to either the family or the community.
All right. And just quickly, Mr. Romanoff, do you believe that Martin Booker's death in Denver was a murder?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Romanoff, you have called for reparations to be paid for centuries of injustice to African Americans. You campaigned last week with former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, who has suggested that $500 billion in reparations would be just. What do you think is a fair number for reparations and a fair process?
I think that's a fair starting point. Look, this crime against humanity, the crime of slavery and centuries of segregation and discrimination that have followed, needs to be remedied. We can't simply declare victory since we have abolished slavery or ended, at least on paper, segregation by law. We also ought to recognize, in my view, that America's other original sin persists as well. The genocide of the Native American population on this continent continues to ripple through so many communities, our tribal communities, who are subjected to unequal conditions to this day. So I think a conversation about reparations needs to lead to action, not just a discussion, but action on both fronts.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you both a question that relates to both healthcare and the COVID-19 pandemic. Rather than criticizing the past response, there will be plenty of time for that in the general election. I would like you both to look forward at how you believe that Congress could strengthen Americans' healthcare system to prepare for the next pandemic or the next wave of COVID-19. Mr. Hickenlooper?
Well, obviously, our preparations were woefully inadequate. And I'm not just talking about President Trump and even Cory Gardner poo-pooing this as not going to be a real pandemic or a real threat. We need to build up our public health infrastructure and make sure that we have the preparations for any kind of a pandemic or any kind of a serious natural disaster in any of the related health fields. Part of that means that we've got to go back to the Center for Disease Control, which President Trump reduced their funding. Cory Gardner supported that. But we also have to make sure that our hospitals across the country have adequate supplies and have ready supply chains for PPE, and to make sure that there are supply chains for testing if we get another pandemic. We need to be prepared for whatever comes forward. And we also have to look at the environmental degradation that Trump, by rolling back the EPA regulations that took decades to put in place, is making the environment around us inherently less safe.
Thank you very much for sticking to time. I understand that's a challenge in this format, and both of you guys are doing a good job with that. Mr. Romanoff, can I ask you, what does Congress need to be doing now to prepare for the next pandemic or the next wave of coronavirus?
We need to adopt a system of Medicare for all, strengthening Medicare by adding benefits for dental and vision and hearing and long-term care, including mental health and substance use treatment, which are even more important now than ever, and then lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 0. This is a place where I differ not only with Cory Gardner, who has voted repeatedly to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but also with John Hickenlooper, who compares plans like this to the work of Karl Marx or Joseph Stalin. I wonder what John would say about Medicare itself. Parroting the talking points of the insurance industry or the Republicans is not going to get us the system we need. And I don't know what you tell John, what you would say to the 500,000 families who are going bankrupt each year because they can't afford their medical bills, or the 72 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured even before the pandemic hit. Your offer of evolution is pretty cold comfort to families in those circumstances.
Mr. Hickenlooper, I would like
Andrew,
to have you respond to what Mr. Romanoff just said, because I know you guys have a difference of opinion, but I want to ask you a direct question to start off this answer, if you would, and then please respond to him. Mr. Hickenlooper, if Democrats take the White House and the Senate, they would be in a position to pass Medicare for All, which Mr. Romanoff supports, and it's something that you oppose. If it came to that, would you vote with Senate Republicans to block Medicare for All?
I have said for a long time that I believe Obamacare is a great foundation on which to get to universal health care. Universal health care is a right, not a privilege. And I believe we need to build upon what Barack Obama created, and Andrew wants to repeal it. I think that if we're able to create a public option that is maybe some form of Medicare Advantage, maybe some parts of Medicaid in there, but a sliding scale public option that allows people to get their health care coverage, and no matter their circumstances. And then we look at how do we begin controlling the costs, letting our government for the first time negotiate bulk discounts in the purchase of prescription drugs for Medicare. that gives you a savings that helps you expand to universal coverage, but it also begins that move towards transparency and fairness that'll help Americans, in every walk of life, to be able to control the enormous increases that they've been having to put up with in terms of insurance and insurance premiums and prescription drugs.
All right. I understand that you guys could go on at some length about this, and you have in forums. I'll let that conversation continue elsewhere while we touch on other important topics.
I just want to point out one thing quickly,
Kyle. You were the first person to
Kyle.
be held in contempt by Colorado's Independent Ethics Commission. You refused a subpoena to testify. They ruled that you broke state ethics laws twice while you were governor. So, Mr. Hickenlooper, are you sorry for breaking the law, and do you regret how you behaved with the Ethics Commission?
Well, I appreciate the chance to be clear about this. As you know, these were allegations about trips I took while I was governor. I made a commitment to travel anywhere and everywhere to try and bring jobs and create economic growth for Colorado. And there's a dark money Republican group that filed 97 allegations against these travels. And the commission came back and found 2 of these violated ethics codes. One was a trip where I went to speak to a conference. I was told I paid all the expenses of the conference. Evidently, there was a sponsor who paid some of the food and perhaps some of the incidental travel. And I accept that. I accept that decision. I accept responsibility. The other was a trip to the commissioning of the USS Colorado. We had over 1,000 military personnel there. A lot of the officers from Washington and from the Pentagon came up, and I flew out on a plane that was commissioned by the founder of the foundation that was funding the ceremony and this important event for Colorado's future.
All right. So if I heard that correctly, take responsibility for the findings, but didn't hear an apology or anything about the fact that you are the first person to be held in contempt by them for refusing a subpoena. I want to ask Mr. Romanoff on this. You suggested that nominating Mr. Hickenlooper jeopardizes Democrats' chances to take this seat from Republican Senator Cory Gardner because of those ethics issues. Is that because you think these are serious ethics issues, or do you just think it's an easy attack for Republicans?
It is both. Look, John Hickenlooper just wrote the Republicans' ad against him twice now. First, when he told everybody in the state he'd be a terrible senator and didn't want the job. I happen to believe him. And now, when he breaks the law, refuses to apologize, defies a subpoena, and becomes, as you said, Kyle, the first person ever held in contempt by an independent ethics commission. You heard John blame the Republicans. You heard him blame the staff. I suppose he even blames the commission, which includes his own appointees who ruled against him. The truth is, John Hickenlooper represents a threat that we cannot afford. I believe he should consider withdrawing from this race.
Mr. Hickenlooper, would you like to respond to that? Your opponent just called for you to withdraw.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that these allegations were waged by a dark money Republican group, and they're going to lay attacks and millions of dollars of smear ads against whoever the Democratic candidate is. And I've campaigned statewide in 2010, 2014, difficult years for Democrats, and won both times. And Andrew, you haven't won an election, in 12 years. I think it's clear that I have a relationship with Coloradans through thick and thin, and that they're going to recognize these as smear attacks that will be used against any Democratic candidate, no matter what their background.
John, you're taking
you
issue
have a difference of opinion as well in terms of climate policy. I do want to move. I think you've both been heard on this. I do want to move on to climate and the environment. I know it's something that you're both passionate about, as are Democratic primary voters, and you have a significant difference of opinion. Mr. Romanoff supports the Green New Deal. Mr. Hickenlooper, you do not support the Green New Deal. Mr. Hickenlooper, you're calling for a slower pace to meet zero emissions and reduced fossil fuel use, and I'm curious whether is it that you don't think that the more aggressive approach is necessary to get the job done, or you don't think that it's possible?
No, I think that I have the same fierce urgency that Andrew has. And I've been working on climate change. Back when I got my master's in environmental science and geology, they called it the greenhouse effect. But the bottom line is we've got to have a concentrated, focused, integrated, comprehensive program to address climate change in the U.S. Senate. It's got to include Getting rid of coal-fired electrical plants has got to include incentives to accelerate transition to electric vehicles. We've got to capture fugitive emissions like methane, which we did in Colorado. We've got to address and incentivize innovation in agriculture and industry. But we have to remember, it's not going to cost an arm and a leg, and it can go fast. We've got to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest. But I think we can get there by 2040, maybe 2045. But we've got to go as quickly as we can and recognize that these innovations are going to create jobs. We're going to create far more jobs than we're going to lose as we transition away from coal and carbon-based energy into wind, solar, and other forms of renewable energy.
Mr. Romanoff, I want to hear from you on climate and the environment as well, but the question is going to come from my colleague, Marshall Zellinger.
Mr. Romanoff, we've watched ash rain down on Commerce City from the Suncor oil refinery. In southwestern Colorado, millions of gallons of toxic waste turned a river yellow. Yet you created a doomsday political ad where a family lived in a bunker, avoiding 127-degree heat and unbearable air quality. Why scare voters with climate Armageddon?
Voters are living in that kind of hell right now. Perhaps not the circumstances portrayed in the ad, but look, if you're living in a community like those you just listed, where your kids can't safely breathe the air or drink the water, or your children are subjected to birth defects because of the kind of runaway oil and gas development that John Hickenlooper presided over and the deterioration in air quality we've seen all along the Front Range, that ad doesn't seem terribly apocalyptic at all. And it is not so distant. In fact, in many communities, the threat is here, real, and now. The question I think ought to go to John Hickenlooper: why do you continue to take money from the fossil fuel industry, hundreds of thousands throughout your career? Why did you sue communities that tried to restrict fracking and protect their public health? Why did you drink the fracking fluid? And why on earth, at this moment, when we face an existential threat, why would you oppose a bold, ambitious plan like the Green New Deal and join Cory Gardner in opposition to that proposal?
Mr. Hickenlooper, 30 seconds to respond here, please.
So we have to have a fierce urgency to climate change, and we have to recognize that the Republicans are trying to stack the deck against us. They're going to do everything in their power to roll back the EPA regulations, to cut apart our protections for clean air and clean water that have been established over decades. And I worked tirelessly to make sure that we had a public health department, a Department of Public Health and the Environment, that was doing the tests and the measurements and beginning the studies to make sure that every neighborhood, every community got the protections that they deserved. The primary purpose of the federal government and the state government is public safety and good health.
I want to get in one last question to each of you before we need to get ready for closing statements. Obviously, Democratic primary voters are interested in your policies. They're also interested in picking somebody who can win, somebody who can withstand criticism. So I want to ask you each about what's described as a common political liability based on your history. Mr. Romanoff, you've lost your last two races, a House race and a U.S. Senate primary. You told me that the lesson you learned is that you need to get more votes next time. And that's good, but I'm not certain that primary voters are going to be satisfied with that answer. What specifically are you going to change about your strategy and your approach to a big race to keep from going 0 for 3?
So I'm proud to have won 4 elections to the State House, to have led the Democrats in Colorado to our first majority in 30 years, our first back-to-back majority since 1960, to be recognized as one of the most effective legislative leaders in America, and to earn endorsements now from 375 state and local elected officials all across Colorado. It's a broad coalition that we will need to beat Cory Gardner. I believe I have the best chance to do that, having spent 4 years in the House debating him. And frankly, I have not, like John has, broken the state ethics law or defied a subpoena or been held in contempt by commissioners I appointed. I think that makes John the riskiest bet in this election.
Mr. Romanoff, thank you. Our final question for Mr. Hickenlooper comes from Marshall.
Mr. Hickenlooper, as governor, you could have commuted the death sentence of the Aurora Chuck E. Cheese killer, but instead you gave him a temporary stay. You've gone back and forth on whether or not you're a capitalist. Senators make yes or no decisions. Why do you find it so hard to take a stance?
Well, I try to get the information necessary to make good decisions. And again and again, what we're seeing in Washington is no decision, right? There's gridlock. I want to go to Washington for change. And I know I badmouthed Washington, and I said it was a place, that Senate was a place where good ideas go to die. But the bottom line is, I worked as governor of Colorado to bring change to Colorado. We got people to work together and create the first methane regulations in the country. We took the state from 40th in job creation to the #1 economy in the country. I want to take that change to Washington. And the same skills that I used in Colorado, bringing people together who maybe didn't agree, but we created compromise. We created the Colorado way to move forward. And it's long overdue. Cory Gardner supported Donald Trump 100% of the time. He said he'd be an independent voice for Colorado, but he hasn't. He's become a yes man for Donald Trump. And I think I can go to Washington and begin to be part of the change that brings the Senate back to its senses.
That's time. Thank you both for staying on time and not interrupting each other in a challenging remote format. This is new for all three of us. I appreciate that. It's time for 45-second closing statements by random draw. Mr. Hickenlooper, you go first, please.
Well, there's no denying these are hard times. From coronavirus to racial injustice, there's a lot of work to do. But Colorado's always met the challenge. When I was governor, we faced natural disasters, mass shootings, the Great Recession, and by coming together, working together, we always made things better than they were before. Now, government dysfunction in Washington has created the worst pandemic and the worst recession, or helped to create the worst pandemic and recession in history. If we're going to change healthcare, if we're going to address climate change, if we're going to create jobs with justice, if we're going to make things better than they were before, we've got to change Washington. By supporting Donald Trump 100% of the time, Cory Gardner has shown he won't do it. Working together, you and I can.
Thank you, Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Romanoff.
I want to say thank you both to John and to you, Kyle and Marshall, for organizing this event. This is no time for timidity. We need bold structural change to address each of the challenges that we've discussed tonight. The climate emergency, the healthcare crisis. We need to build an economy that works for everyone. But to do that, we need a government that works for everyone. And we don't have a government like that so far. Instead, we've got a government funded by special interest groups. Unfortunately, those groups are bankrolling both sides of the aisle. I don't take money from the fossil fuel industry or the drug companies or the insurance companies. I should acknowledge they're not offering. They have other candidates they prefer in this race. So I'm asking Coloradans to invest in our campaign instead, to go to andrewromanoff.com and chip in, get involved.
Thank you very much. That, voters, is a short sampling of what the two Democratic Senate primary candidates have to say. You can learn more about their positions on 9news.com. We would invite both of them to join us on Next in the coming days as voters make their decisions. Look for ballots soon. June 30th is the deadline to get them back. Thanks for joining us. Good night.